So I'm hosting this conversation today as a part of a series called Ripples and Rumbles, Subverting Leadership. And I'm really excited. This is an opportunity to have conversations with people that I find really interesting and smart about topics that they really care about. And to subvert means to turn from below. And this could mean from the lower levels, but also from places that are hidden or unspoken, taken for granted, invisible. These are places inside ourselves and in our relationships that we sometimes don't know how to talk about. But the smallest ripples in the stories that we take for granted can lead to big rumbles of change. And so in this series, we will be talking with a range of change practitioners about the inner shifts and the questions we can ask to step into leadership in ways that are nurturing and regenerative. And we'll talk about power and conflict and fluidity and adaptability and learning to lead together. So thank you for joining us for the first of these conversations that question our dominant stories about leadership. I wanted to just give you a little note about participation. We're recording this talk and sharing it. And because of this, we'll be sharing the audio. And because of this, we'll be asking participants to stay muted. But you're very welcome to put questions for me or for Louise in the chat, and we'll respond to as many as we can as we're going through the conversation. So today's conversation is called Dancing with Power, Equity-Centered Leadership in Complex Times. And for those of us who step into informal or formal leadership roles in our organizations and communities with the hopes of creating a more just world, we need to befriend our power. Power doesn't have to be a dirty word. And we can't get to justice and social change out in the world unless leaders are also doing their inner work. So at the heart of equity-centered leadership is the conscious and intentional use of power. And at the heart of a transformed system is doing and distributing power differently. So I'm so excited to have my friend and collaborator, Louise Pitre, here to talk with me about leadership, equity, and power. And Louise is a leadership and systems coach, a facilitator and consultant with 30 years experience in government and nonprofit, cultivating systems change to create a more equitable and just society. And she journeys with leaders, teams, and communities, co-creating brave spaces for heart-centered and embodied conversations about power, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Louise is also a dear friend of mine and the co-creator and facilitator of a group learning journey that we developed called Reimagining Power, Gender Leadership and Change. So thank you so much for being here, Louise. I'm really thrilled to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Brooke. I'm really excited, and it's so nice to see some familiar faces here on the webinar. And yeah, I'm just really glad to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I want to just start off by asking you to tell the story about how you came to this work. Why is the focus on power so important to you?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back a few years. I grew up in a family with a Quebecois mother and Anglophone father, and a mother who gave me two messages. And part of her messaging to me, and in part it was because of the family she grew up in and the family that we were in, but part of her messaging was to get an education. And so that was about having the power of knowledge. And then her other message, and part of that was also, she was an administrative assistant, is what we would say, today, but a secretary at that time. And she had wanted to have more for herself, and to have a different role. And she also, talked about economic security. So I grew up with some messaging around power, and that kind of took me down a path. I also had a sister who passed away at a fairly young age. And so I was very interested in health equity and wanted to be a doctor. And that didn't happen for me. So thought, well, I'll do my master's in health administration. And so I ended up at the age of 25 in a formal leadership role in a hospital, in an academic health sciences center. and knowing nothing really about management or leadership. Well, maybe knowing something about management because that was part of my degree. But and so that's how I came into leadership. And I was in the hospital for 12 years, and it was a really it was a great place for me to learn and for me to develop some skills. But it was also the place where I recognized, even though I had wanted, so I'm one of those people who wanted power, who wanted to be able to influence, and stepped into this positional power role at a young age, and also discovered that there were different ways to do power, right? So I started off in a way that was more top down, that was more patriarchal, and very quickly, thank God, very quickly learned from mentors and the people with whom I was working with that wasn't going to work. And so even though my positional power opened up doors for me, it wasn't the positional power that gave me influence. It was how I used my strengths and my, the gifts that I had. Like I remember at one point, the two of the hospitals in our community merged, and I was promoted to the director of emergency and trauma care programs. And my task was to merge the 3 departments and emergency departments, and we had a retreat and with the nursing staff and all the professional healthcare teams other than the physicians. And the intention of the retreat was to develop shared leadership. The intention of the retreat was to develop councils so that, and my role in that, given I never had a clinical background, was to hold space for people, was to listen, was to, create an opportunity for them to shine their shine. And so it was so that's how I came to the work. That's how I started off. And then, as I became a mother and connected to my own trauma and also connected to my own feminist heart, recognized that being at the hospital was not going to be, the place for me. And then I ended up at Status of Women Canada and ended up working with the grassroots groups who were, working to advance gender equity in all of its forms. And so what I realized is that there was another way of leading and being. And then I went into, I became an executive director in the nonprofit sector at the Sexual Assault Centre London. And and what I learned is that, and I think this is why I have this interest in power, especially when I left Family Service Thames Valley in 2017, that we have to, if we're going to step into a formal role of leadership, we really have to take the time to understand our own relationship to power, where that's come from, and how we use our power. Because when we hold positional power, we have the ability to do lots of good. We also have the ability to create harm. Yeah. And and so for me, leadership it became a vocation. It became a way of being in the world. It became a way of creating change. But I also, as I left the nonprofit and started my own business, just had this moment of, wow, and my work has been really in the nonprofit. A lot of it has been in the nonprofit, and it's always been about, let's create justice out there. Let's make things happen out there. And that's important. And yet we can't do that unless we, tend to the soil, the organizational soil, and the relationships within an organization. Mm-hmm. And we look at equity, and we look at justice, and we look at how oppression and power is playing out in an organization. and then within ourselves. So that's been, I guess, some steps toward, my journey.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One of the things that I really appreciate about working with you around these things is that you have an extremely complex understanding of power that I think really considers, everything that you're talking about, sort of that positional power, the leadership, the ways that that can be, helpful in moving things forward, but also cause harm. But you also have a really clear sense, and I think you sort of spoke to this a little bit when you were saying that you appreciate power and you wanted power, that it is actually the thing that we need to make things happen, and that it's important, and that we can't just sort of put it in the bucket of, oh, this is bad and people, it's oppressive and all of these kinds of things, that is a piece of it. And that is a huge part of the reality that we have to talk about. But that also there's this other piece of it that is a lot more complex than that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that goes back to there are different kinds of power, right? And my definition of leadership is broad. There isn't just positional, being in a position of power. That isn't, to me, my definition of leadership is I use Meg Wheatley's definition, notice what you care about and then go do something about it. And the something you do is, based on the strengths and gifts and the contributions you want to make. But power doesn't have to be a dirty word. Right? It's energy. Power is energy. And if we can, if we can connect to it in a way that it is it can be an energy for good, then we can work with that. Yeah. Thank
you. So, I'm curious about when we were talking about titles and questions and all of these kinds of things. The title that came up that I think really resonated with you was Dancing with Power. And, I think that's not necessarily a common metaphor that people use when thinking about the relationship to power. And, so tell me more about that. What's that about? Yeah. So thank you for asking that question. And when we were, preparing for this, I told you that was really quite a gift for you to have asked me that question, because I hadn't necessarily thought about it too much, but there's lots of reasons for dancing with power. And one simple one is, I love to move, I love to dance. And it has energy to it. And power to me is energy. And so part of dancing with power is also about, kind of being connected to your own life force and being connected to your own personal power and using that in terms of moving systems forward, creating change. Dancing with Power, I first used in 2006 for a presentation that I prepared for a local group that was focused on women in leadership, but they were focused on creating a different kind of mental health system for women. And that was the title of my presentation, Dancing with Power. And so that was, 17 years ago. And I used it then. And at that time, it was a recognition for me that my approach to leadership and the dance partner that I had was masculine energy. It was, competitive. It was, Western ways of doing things. It was focus on productivity, focus on reaching the top. It was just masculine energy. And what I realized as I moved over to Status of Women Canada and worked with all of these feminist groups is that one of my birthrights is that feminine energy. I was born into some of that feminine energy, and yet it wasn't showing up in my leadership. And so for me, it was about embracing also, the feminine into my leadership, into the use of power. So, so those are the ways. I'm just because I had other thoughts around the Dancing with Power, and I just want to take a look at what else. But part of it was for sure connecting to the piece around feminist spirituality. Part of it was my own, personal power.
yeah, and I think that we're in relationship with power. Like let's not pretend we're not. And let's not pretend we don't have power. And so for me, it is about acknowledging that relationship and that flow and that energy. And it's a dance. And if it's a dance, then that means it can shift. It means also, depending on the context, you can use your power differently. You can have a different dance partner. You can dance. It could be a different dance, whether it's a jazz or a tango or a jive, like whatever. Like so that's why I use the dancing with power. And then recently, and I see that Annie is here, it's also embodied. And you know that I like to be, embodied. And I'm learning that, that there are certain ways in which we embody power, right? And I think part of my next journey is going even deeper with that embodiment piece. And I think dance will be important to that. I think movement will be important to that. I think theater will be important to that, to really unpack, how does power live in me, in my body, without me even noticing it? And a story that I could share with you is I remember I was the AD of one of the organizations that I was leading at the time, and my administrative assistant let me know that someone asked what I was like as a boss. And she responded to them that, well, she's the boss. Like, she's the boss. And I was like, oh my gosh, what? And I said, and then she says, don't worry. But she goes, that was a compliment. She says, you're confident, and you also know where you're going and what you want. And I also told her you listen really well. And so I thought I've been thinking about that and just embodiment, right? And how there are ways that we can embody power that is inviting and approachable, and other ways where we might embody power where we're protected and armored and not approachable. So dancing with power, it's all of that. It's all of that.
There's so much in what you just said that I kind of want to dig into more. Okay. And also, if other people have questions, feel free to put those in the chat and we will get to them at some point. But there were a couple pieces that sort of came up in there, and there's like a bit of a thread for me in what you're saying between this piece that you said that, we all have power, which I think, there are definitely times, I think, for many people when there's a feeling that is not true, that we don't all have power. And so that kind of, that stuck me a little bit, right? Like I was like, oh yes, this is a piece that I think we should come back to. And that also the way that actually connects with this piece around embodiment that you're talking about. Like, what does it feel like when we know that we have power? What does it feel like to be able to step into power in a way that feels generative, or that feels transformative, or that feels like there's possibility in it? So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. It's not actually a clear question because I'm just kind of riffing on what you were saying. But
that's great. I like it. Yeah. I like that you're riffing. Yeah. And I always I need to remember to be careful sometimes too, when I make the comment, we all have power, because it is an edge, right? It's and there are times in our lives, like there are times in my life where I didn't have power. Right. And there was a difference of power. And, as a teenager or with a parent and so those are realities. That's a truth. And in different situations and work environments, there's certainly, if we're not the boss, we may feel like we're not in a position, to make a certain decision. So I think that there's I appreciate the sentiment, and I'll, just recently someone, informally, who's an executive director in a nonprofit and leading a certain community panel, came to talk to me and said, I don't have power. And so we kind of unpacked that. And at the end, you may not have control over certain circumstances, but it is about identifying identifying where is it that I have choice, and understanding that that's imperfect. It is imperfect, and there could be some sense of injustice in that for sure. But I think so. For me, it's about that. It's about what is it that you can control in this moment? What are the choices that you can make in this moment? How is it that you can get grounded, step into your personal power? I mean, if you think of Nelson Mandela, there was someone there with a tremendous amount of personal power, right? And so what is it that you can access in this moment, recognizing that, yeah, there will be injustices, and it's not okay. Like, I want to make sure that, yeah, that I say that. There was something else you said about the embodiment piece, and I forget.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, and I mean, I think that this sort of connects to the piece that we were talking about also around sort of equity and sort of stepping into the work of actually doing the transformational pieces, right? Where it's like power is partially the ways that we actually feel into our own capacity to, there's this, this definition that of power that I recently heard by Larissa Conte, that power is the capacity to move energy through a system. And it's like, that's such a simple idea. And it's also so complex, right? To really think about all of the different ways that we move energy through a system. And some of those ways are really helpful ways, and some of those ways are really destructive ways. And, thinking about that from sort of the lens of moving toward more equity and sort of more social transformation for like positive change, like coming back to like, what have you learned either through your own experience or working with people around power? I mean, you've done so much work with people around this kind of question. What have you learned from that about that sort of what it is to like step into power, to be able to move energy through a system in ways that are moving toward the kinds of systems that we want to see? I don't know, that might have been really all over the place, but I feel like you're good with those things.
Yeah, no, it's good. I'm just like, wow, okay. That's like such a huge question.
Sorry.
So first of all, no, don't apologize. Don't apologize at all. Like, first of all, I love that definition that you introduced me to just recently. Like, it's just, yeah. So I just want to go to that definition for a second, and then I'll come back. But part of when I think of that definition, for me, it just opens up so much possibility then, right? To me, I have this image of a big ball of energy, like just and then there's hundreds of people, and maybe 2 rows of people, and this ball of energy, and we're all passing it along. And I feel like that's part a little bit of the systems change, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a line, it could be a loop, it doesn't have to be linear, but we all have a role to play. And the role that we play is dependent, on our strengths and our gifts, and our strengths and our gifts are connected to our personal power, dependent on the role that we're playing in a system, the influence that we can have. And so we have capacity to just push that ball of energy along. If you imagine that being, part of the change or the power, and moving that along. There's a really nice, where is it? I don't have the link here, but there's and I can find the link, but there's someone who's doing some work around social change mapping, and just, different roles that we play, like a bridge builder, a visionary, a disruptor, first responder. So that was the thought that I had when you talked about that energy, that definition of power is the capacity to move energy through a system. Yeah. I think I think part of capacity piece is also connected to, and this is connected to personal power. I think if you step into a formal position of power in an organization, and I don't know how this works for corporations, but like to me, leadership is vocation. And I think you need to know your higher purpose. And if you're going to be in the nonprofit, if you're going to be in social innovation, it is about creating justice. And so, like so I would suspect that, to be able to move that forward, there's an inner piece around knowing who you are and knowing, the change that you're wanting to create. And I also think it's also about the power of the collective and the power of collaboration and the power of co-creation and not being isolated. So the patriarchal, dominant approach to leadership is like there's one hero. And I think in regenerative, nurturing ways, that's not what it's about. It really is it's the contribution I can make in this collective to move this ball of energy to create a more just world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I want to, I'd want to just come back because you've talked a few times about, it's hard to follow. It's like there's many things that I want to follow, like the bouncing ball on many different things. But I want to just come back and ask you to say just a little bit more about personal power, because you've referred to that a couple times.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering, can you just say a little bit about sort of what, like you're talking about personal power, as what exactly, like just so that people are kind of on the same page in terms of what we're talking about.
Yeah. I'm debating in my head if I give you the Julie Diamond definition of personal power. Just for those of you who may not know, in terms of some of the work that I've been doing, I've certainly been influenced by grassroots leaders, had a number of different mentors, and in particular people who represent socially disadvantaged groups or equity deserving groups, and so those, and I've also been immersed in Julie Diamond's work and the framework called power intelligence. And so personal power can be pulled apart, and it could be about it's about your sense of self in terms of being able to overcome obstacles or challenges, your ability to be grounded and focused on what the work that you're going to do, and also having a higher purpose, being connected to really this this sense of who you are, how you make meaning of your life and of the world, and so it's all of that put together, right? And some people talk about resilience, but it really is like your sense of efficacy and an ability to be able to what's the word I want to find? Yeah, self-efficacy, being connected to a higher purpose. So for me, the reason why I could do the work that I was doing, because sometimes it would get really hard. I was an executive director of a rape crisis center and then a mental health organization, and there's lots of hard stuff. And but I was able to stay in it by staying connected to my personal power, which for me was my sense of purpose is really huge. And also I have a belief, like I have confidence that I can overcome challenges. I may not be as good around being grounded because I'm a bit reactive and all that kind of stuff. But well, that I am, like, I just, yeah. but that's personal power. Is that a good enough? What do you
Yeah.
think, Brooke? Is
Yeah,
that good?
totally. I mean, I guess I
of-
would just say that it's like, I think another piece of this is that, there's like all the kinds of power that we think of around sort of identity or around position, right? Like I'm the leader of an organization or all of those kinds of things. And those are
Yeah.
sources of power that other people bestow on us, but personal
Mhm.
power is sort of the inner power that comes from our own way of being in the world. And it's also possible to grow it, right? So like a lot of the kind of work around supporting sort of collaborative use of power is about supporting people to kind of step into personal power, build the capacity, all of these kinds of pieces.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's like, there's a lot of potential there because of the possibility of growing it and the fact that it's this sort of efficacy and sort of knowing that it's possible to make change.
Yes, well done.
Thank you. So, I want to just say also that, this, like I have always known, as long as I've known you, that you are very passionate about exploring leadership power and particularly because you're certain that if we could do power differently, that it would be possible to transform our relationships and our systems. And I'm wondering if you could tell me more about what you see as the potential there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know what? I wanna give you a quote. So let me just go find this quote to answer part of that question. And at one time I was working as hired as a consultant to do a developmental evaluation for a group in rural Ontario that were looking at developing pathways to employment for visible minority newcomer women. And I want to read a quote from one of the project coordinators that is an example of flipping a narrative and thinking about systems change and within that, the role of power. And so this was the quote: breaking down barriers to employment for visible minority newcomer women is the work of everyone and does not rest on the shoulders of the visible minority newcomer women to change themselves. It is not the women who have created the barriers. It is not the fact that women do not have Canadian experience that they have barriers to employment. It is the fact that we have systems and ways of doing things that close the door on their ability to engage in the labor market. Mm-hmm. And for me, that quote, first of all, I love it, but so imagine if we understand, right, if we buy in, let's say, to the way in which we do power can contribute to, a shift in relationships, can contribute to a shift in a system. And so in this moment, this coordinator flips the narrative and immediately centers, right, the equity deserving group. And instead of centering the employers, that the individual in this, so this is just on a small scale initiative, right? This individual centers the visible minority newcomer women. And it no longer becomes, the project is no longer about helping women write resumes, helping women interview. It completely shifts the narrative and the approach to eliminating the barriers that our Western ways of doing things create for people who are newcomers. And the way in which these individuals, there were two coordinators, did their work, the unit of productivity was relationships. So it was building relationships with employers and having conversations with employers. It was building relationships with the visible minority newcomer women. It was building relationships with settlement services, employment agencies. And so it was just, recognizing that this is an ecosystem, that we're interconnected, and that we have to have a strong connective tissue. And in the end, employers made changes to their systems, right? To welcome and to be able to benefit from the skills of visible minority newcomer women. And also at the end, they created a collective of visible minority newcomer women. So agency had increased. And so I think for me, when I think about leadership, I go, that's leadership, right? And you're creating equity and justice. But in order to have done that, you have had to shift your mental models. You have to think differently about relationships, and you had to shift power. And the visible minority newcomer women were part of that project right from the beginning. They were part of a steering committee. They were involved every step of the way. So when I'm on a small scale, anyways, that's an example of what I think about when I think about power and leadership and systems change.
Yeah.
And what I believe, you're able to create change. And I have, when I was in one of the nonprofits where I was at, it was an organization that had been around for about 70 years. And its roots were Christian, meaning it had been what's the word? It had been founded by the Catholic Church. And I was 1 year into my executive director role, and this organization was all about supporting families and individuals in their mental health, and the mission was to decrease barriers to access. And not one penny of the budget went to LGBTQIA plus families. That doesn't mean we didn't welcome not hetero families, but it does. But there was no budget, and it was two queer racialized women who came to see me and said, we need a program for people coming out. We need to support the 2SL LGBTQIA plus community. And they had the vision, they knew what was needed, and I had no budget, but I had authority, I had power, and so I could divert, take funds and direct them to a program that was needed in our community. And so that again, this is super small scale, right? In one organization. But if we're going to create justice, and if we're going to so that example, that wasn't me. That I didn't have the vision for that. Right? I don't identify, I identify as cis, hetero, I'm, part of the dominant culture, right? So, but it's about listening, and it's about knowing when you have leaders in front of you and giving them the resources and the environment and the conditions they need to create change, right? Yeah. That's what I mean.
Yes, and I have many things to say about that. But first, I just want to say that there is a request. Is it possible to share that quote either in the chat, or if you want, you could send it to me and I could send it out to people if you think that that's okay. Someone was just saying it's very powerful.
Let me, right now it's in white, and yes, I can send that to you. Let me work on that. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
But don't worry about it too much right now. We can also follow up afterwards, and I can send that out to people.
Okay. It is a good quote, isn't it? That person was amazing.
It's a great quote. And, it's interesting because I was thinking about, what you're saying about the small scale, and it's making me think about, and there's, you were sort of giving an example, you gave two examples there, and one of them was really very much sort of community driven, right? And organized, and lots of leadership sort of coming from a grassroots community sort of perspective. And then you gave another example that was still that, but it was also an example of you in a formal position of leadership being able to notice the power relationship that was there and step into power in a way that was about supporting that, those people that were coming forth to request something, right? And so there is this possibility of a different kind of relationship between people who are stepping into sort of more informal leadership and people who are stepping in, who are inhabiting more formal leadership, to be able to sort of do that kind of power sharing, or recognize the different roles that different people have in terms of accessing the resources or moving that energy through the system, or all of those kinds of pieces. So I really appreciated both of those examples.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about also what you were saying around small scale, and it made me think about this conversation that we had actually a couple days ago, I think, where we were talking about how sometimes it's really easy to feel very powerless in the face of systems, right? Because it feels big, it feels confusing, it feels like whatever small amount of power we might have in that context is not enough to actually move things. But I really appreciated, we were talking about it in relation to this question of small scale and recognizing the impacts that people are having in a range of different ways, and the ripples that come out from all of those actions. And it makes me think of I listened to this podcast called Sandy and Nora, and Sandy is Sandy Hudson, who is sort of like a long-term, was one of the people who started Black Lives Matter in Toronto. Yeah. And she has, I'm going to totally misquote this, I'm just bringing it up out of my head, but my partner has it on her wall. And it's something to the effect of, we don't have to be afraid about trying to change systems because systems are made up of people, right? And that's not exactly it, but that we all actually, and this is part of the personal power piece, I think, is being able to recognize that there are ways that we can have impact that can actually have pretty big, if we can think about it strategically and find the right alliances and, create the right sort of relationships and all of these kinds of things, there can be more and more ripple of impact that can come out of that. So that's just sort of what I was thinking of as you were talking. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I think that's really important, right? I think what I said to you is we are the system. And when I was in healthcare, I was influenced a lot by Tim Porter O'Grady's work and Bonnie Resrick, and they there was someone who wrote this poem called "We Are the System," and I think and of course we have different roles and different accountabilities and different responsibilities, within organizations. But I think let's not forget that when we're talking about the system, we're the system. We are the system. And that is where you can influence. It is about taking a look at the ripples you can make right here, and with the resources that you have, for sure.
And that's also about doing that inner work of noticing the ways that those larger systemic issues are showing up in our own lives and our choices and our actions. What do I need to unlearn, about white supremacy or about patriarchy or about all of these things, right? And how can I do that inner work as well as that relational work in order to make those shifts as well?
Yeah. And I appreciate you bringing that up, because for me now, I'm talking about inner shifts, culture shifts, and system shifts. And it's that is the ripple, right? That is the ripple. And part of the rumbling is our own rumbling. I know we're going to play with this metaphor, is our own rumbling, right? With our own inner work, right? And it does start there. And in particular, if you're not doing your own inner work and you have access, when I started off my career, I had access to $10 million. I had access to 150 full-time equivalents, right? Access. I mean, those were the resources, right? And you cannot, you have to do your own inner work, because the harm you can do is pretty significant if you're leaking power, right? Meaning you're no longer grounded and you're unconscious about how you're using your own power. It can just be so harmful to individuals and to the system.
Yeah. Do you want to speak any more about that?
Like what? Do you have something in mind? I'm thinking.
I don't know. I don't have a specific question around it. I just, I feel like this is another big Another big
Yeah.
piece, right? I mean, we've talked quite a bit about personal power and about being in that dance and recognizing that power is a lot more complex than we tend to think about it. And then there is also the side of it that tends to be where people tend to go, right? And I think so a lot of your work really is about supporting people in leadership to step into their power in healthier, more, sort of expansive, more supportive ways, right? So I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I think, yes. So, thank you. That's helpful. For sure. Like, just not using power is and all not using the power that you have, in particular if you're in a position of power and you hold leadership power, can also be harmful, right? It can be harmful if there's bullying going on in the organization. It can be harmful if, right now, as nonprofits or social innovation organizations or corporations, if you're not using your power to move the needle on truth and reconciliation, hello, like hello, like why not, right? Like, I mean, and so that's one piece. I mean, and there's also, it's very interesting to me, especially for folks who identify as female or gender non-binary, and having conversations around power, and when they're the CEO of an organization and that's the power that they're least comfortable with. And when you unpack that, trying to, understand that can also be harmful. If you're not comfortable with the power that you have, then there's a need to connect, to figure out what that's about, right? Again, that's connected to our relationship to power. It's connected to, how are you seeing power? And are you seeing it as something that's bad? And because then you're not conscious about how you're using your power. And in hierarchies, love them or not, even in collectives, power will still show up. It'll just find different ways to show up, right? Whether, who's the tallest and who's the most articulate, who's the one who has the best analysis, right? Who's on the right side of justice. Like, they're just different ways in which that will show up. Yeah. So I guess, yes. And there were times, and for me, if I go back and look at the times when I'm aware that I created harm, it was often directed more to racialized women. I need to look at that. I need to sit with that and go, okay, what's that really about? Right? As a white woman, what was that about? What was that about? And one of the patterns for me was connected to how grounded I was, right? And how I was, and so it was grounded. It was around how I was being triggered, how my power was leaking. Yeah. And that's how it came out. It came out in harmful ways. Yep.
Yeah. So I want to just pause here. I have more questions for sure, but I'm also aware that we only have about 10 minutes. So if there's questions that other people have, I do see one that has just come up. Can you say a little bit more about what power leaking means?
Yeah. So that term comes from Julie Diamond, and it for me, what it means is when I forget that in the moment I have power, and therefore I behave a certain way that is not consistent with the way that I would behave. And so so it could be like it could be something triggers you, and you're in flight freeze, fawn, I forget the other one right now, but so that's what, does that make sense, Leah? Are you yeah. And Julie Diamond, if you look up diamondleadership.com, Julie Diamond is an author. She's a consultant. She's written the book Power, A User's Guide. And her framework is really useful. It is rooted in Western ways of thinking, I think, around power. And however, it's very useful as a framework to that you can overlay your own cultural, knowledge around power. And it's very useful to have conversations around, around power.
Yeah. And also, I would also just say that, Julie Diamond has developed a sort of leadership power assessment, which can be really helpful, particularly in contexts where, there's sort of a feeling that there needs to be some work around leadership power. That can be a really good way to offer some feedback about how people can start thinking about doing power differently. And thank you, Jody, for there's an article that Jody just put in the chat specifically.
It's really good.
White women doing white supremacy in nonprofit culture, if anyone wants to take a look. So, as we're sort of moving toward the end, I wanted to just ask you, what is feeling right now like it's the most inspiring or hopeful for you in your work with leadership power?
Well, for me, I think it's people actually want to talk about power right now. And so I started my business in 2017, in August 2017, and I was talking about power at that time. I've been talking about power probably since, I was 25. I'm talking about it now in lots of different ways. Yeah. And hopefully in better ways now. And right now what's happened, I remember speaking to colleagues who were consultants and, asking them for their support and to bring me in, and they wouldn't touch me with a 10-foot pole. Like they just wouldn't, they couldn't even, and these are individuals who understood the issues. And now today, people are willing to have the conversation. And that is heartwarming. And it's coming not only from nonprofits or social entrepreneurs, it is also coming from the corporate sector. People are willing to have that conversation. So I think for me, that's heartwarming. And the other thing is that's inspiring. I think that there are lots of folks from equity deserving groups and young people who are just being so courageous and fearless and fierce, not fearless, but fierce, and willing to lead differently and willing to do power differently. And when I look at them, I go, wow, like you're already there. You already know, so they provide inspiration. Yeah.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. It's been a great pleasure, as always, to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Brooke.
I just want to let people know if you, there's going to be a few links that are put in the chat. If you want more information about Louise's work, you can go to louisepitreconsulting.ca. It'll be put in the chat. And then there's a short feedback survey. We'd love to hear sort of how this conversation was for you. So any feedback is very welcome. Good, bad, mixed, all of it is really, really helpful and important. And thank you for that. And also there's going to be a link for the next session that's coming up in this 4-part conversation series, which is called Queering the Workplace: We're Everything Everywhere All at Once. And that's with Tanya Chang. And that's going to be coming up on June 20th. And I think it'll be another very interesting conversation. So stay tuned and let us know your thoughts about all of this. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Louise, for sharing your years of thought and reflection and practice around these questions. And your learnings and some of your learnings through foibles and some of your learnings through things going well and all the rest of it. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you as always.
Thank you. It was good to be here today. Really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone being here. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for being here.